Okay, my topic today is a book that I wrote called The Three Languages of Politics. And a central theme in that book is the difference between a demonization mode of rhetoric and a persuasion mode of rhetoric. So this difference between demonization mode and persuasion mode is very important, and I want to nail that down. I'm going to ask you to do an exercise. You can do this while you're sitting there. Just take about 5 or 10 seconds and try to pantomime using your facial expression and your hand gestures demonization. So think of uh, you were in traffic and somebody cut you off and almost caused an accident, and how you would feel and how you'd want to show that person what a terrible thing they've done, and sort of pantomime demonizing that person. Okay, and now as an exercise, similarly, by the way, you can just sort of hit pause to do this exercise, so you don't have to, you can take however long you want to do it. Take a few seconds and act out using your hand gestures and your facial expressions, persuasion mode, where you're trying to persuade somebody. So imagine you just saw a movie that you think is great, and a friend of yours has read reviews and is not interested in seeing the movie, and you're trying to persuade your friend, no, you really ought to go see this movie. Show what you would look like in that process of persuading. So you can hit pause and go do that exercise. Okay, so what I want you to notice is the difference between how you behave physically when you're demonizing someone versus how you're trying to persuade someone. So when you try to demonize someone, you're tense and your fists tend to be closed. So in some sense, your mind is closed. You're physically tense and you're closed-minded. When you're trying to persuade someone, your gestures tend to be more open. Your eyebrows may go up, your face is more open, and your mind is more open. And it has to be more open because you have to understand where a person stands now in order to take them, persuade them to where you want them to be. So these are two very different modes of operating. I want to point out that they really are mutually exclusive. If you're trying to demonize someone, you cannot persuade them. If you're trying to persuade someone, you cannot demonize them. And so the book, The Three Languages of Politics, revolves around that theme. And what I'll talk about is how our rhetoric can serve to demonize, why we use demonization rhetoric, why demonization may be worse now than it was even in, let's say, the 1960s, when there was a lot of cultural conflict, and some speculation about what the causal factors are in why we have switched to more demonization in this century than we did in the last century. So the three languages of politics speak to this issue of how we demonize. My claim is that there are three tribes: progressives, conservatives, and libertarians. And each has its own way of demonizing people from the other tribes. Think of three bads. The three bads being oppression, that is, one group of people mistreating another group as a group. That's oppression. Then think of barbarism, that is, people reverting to forms of behavior that civilized people no longer think are proper. That's barbarism. And the third bad is coercion, which is getting somebody to do something they don't want to do by using force or threatening them with the use of force. So those are all bad. We would agree that oppression is bad, barbarism is bad, and coercion is bad, but each tribe makes, in some sense, an exclusive claim on being opposed to one of those bads. That is, the progressives will make an exclusive claim that they're the ones who oppose oppression. And they will demonize anyone who disagrees with them as being on the side of oppressors. Conservatives make an exclusive claim to concern with barbarism, and they will demonize anyone who disagrees with them as being on the side of barbarism. And libertarians make an exclusive claim to being opposed to coercion, especially the coercion that comes from government, which has the monopoly on the legitimate use of force. And so conservatives will demonize anyone who disagrees with them as being on the side of coercion. So let me give like some examples that will illustrate how these tribes might operate. Um, last year there was a controversy where some professional football players would kneel during the national anthem, and that was kind of a protest gesture. So from a progressive point of view, these were African American football players. African Americans are part of an oppressed group. And if you were opposed to the players kneeling, that in a progressive framing puts you on the side of oppression. So that was so that's how they would frame the football players kneeling during the national anthem. For conservatives, the national anthem and the American flag are symbols of America's proud civilization. And so if you were in favor of the players kneeling, if you weren't against them, then you were in fact supporting disrespecting the American flag and the American national anthem, and therefore you're on the side of barbarism. And libertarians, I'm not sure, they have various ways of framing this, but one way of framing this is that the custom of standing for the national anthem and saluting the flag at a football game is really a form of state worship. And so indirectly it supports coercion. And so so a libertarian might think that nobody should have to stand for the national anthem and to salute the flag before a football game. And if you think that people should, then you're supporting coercion. So that's one example of how the rhetoric of demonization comes through in these three languages. So I'd like you as an exercise to see if you can, again, you can hit pause whenever you want and take as long as you want to do this. But go back to another news story of the hearings involving Brett Kavanaugh to be a Supreme Court justice, and think of how the oppressor-oppressed framing was used, how the civilization barbarism framing was used, and maybe how the liberty coercion framing was used. So see if on your own you can think of how the three tribes would have expressed their rhetoric about the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. Okay, so I'll try to answer that question. In the oppressor-oppressed framing, the accusation by Christine Blasey Ford that Brett Kavanaugh as a teenager had engaged in some sort of sexual assault, that was someone from an oppressed class trying to speak up against someone from an oppressor class. And so that's how a progressive might have framed the Kavanaugh hearings. For conservatives, they saw protesters screaming in the Senate hallway. They saw that the way the accusation was brought up was, it wasn't sent through normal FBI channels. It was instead sent through Democratic congressmen so that they thought that ordinary procedures were being violated, and this was sort of uncivilized and barbaric. And for libertarians, there was probably more of a concern of how uh, Kavanaugh might actually rule if he became a Supreme Court justice. Would he defend the Constitution or not? So that would be how they might look at it from a liberty coercion perspective. Finally, let me give you a more recent example, another exercise. You may know that on July 4th, uh, President Trump gave a speech in front of Mount Rushmore. And pay no attention to the content of the speech, because no one did pay any attention to the content of the speech, but come up with the framing that a progressive, a conservative, and a libertarian would have used for that speech. And again, I'll let you hit pause for however long you want to do that exercise. So my answers might be the progressives see Trump generally as symbolizing uh, a sort of white supremacy, and standing in front of Mount Rushmore, he is just reinforcing uh, this sort of the dominance of white males in our society. So that they framed it that way along the oppressor-oppressed axis. Conservatives, of course, would see Mount Rushmore as symbolizing the greatness of American civilization. And so anyone who thought that that President Trump was wrong to speak in front of Mount Rushmore was actually supporting barbarism. And libertarians, again, might be worried about the state worship issue, that you're standing in front of Mount Rushmore, you're kind of celebrating the state and political leaders, and that indirectly supports coercion. So that might be how it would be framed by libertarians. So that's sort of a game you can play of how the different tribes would frame different issues. And a lot of the purpose for me for writing the book and explaining that is to catch yourself before you start framing issues that way, or when a pundit who you sympathize with and that you agree with starts to frame issues that way, whoa, back off. Realize that they're trying to get you to demonize other people. It's really not a persuasive way of looking at things. I mean, if we really wanted to be persuasive about Mount Rushmore, we might actually read the speech, comment on President Trump's speech, look at what he said, and say, well, here's what's wrong with it, here's what's right with it, rather than jump into the symbolic representation and frame it in terms of this three languages rhetoric. So that's sort of how people demonize one another. That was my story there. I talk at great length in the book about why they do it, talking about the psychology of it. There's individual psychology. There are many aspects of it. One aspect of it is that it's low effort cognitively to demonize someone rather than to think in terms of persuasion. That is, if I can dismiss your point of view saying, I know you have bad motives, I don't care what you're saying, I know why you're saying it, it's because your motives are bad, you're barbaric, or you're on the side of the oppressors, or whatever. Once I can dismiss what you have to say, it's cognitively easier for me. I don't have to think through the content of your thoughts. I just dismiss you as a person, as being on the opposite side. And so that there's some psychological appeal to demonization that way. There's also social psychology, which is tribal psychology. Once I identify, let's say, as a libertarian, if libertarians decide that I'm not playing for their team, in effect, they excommunicate me, and that makes me feel like, if I were in an ancient tribe, a prehistoric tribe, I've been kicked out of my tribe, and that means I'm out in the wilderness on my own, and I'm going to die. So the tribal psychology makes you lead you to want to express loyalty to your own tribe, and that includes demonizing people of other tribes. But this psychology, of course, has existed for a long time. Why are things worse? Or are things, in fact, worse now than they have been in the past? And I have a reason for arguing that things are at least worse in the 1960s. My memory of the 1960s, I'm in high school in 1967 through 71, and in college from 71 to 75. And in high school and college, I had friends who were both hippies and straights. You know, that was kind of the cultural cleavage at the time. And not only that, but my friends who were hippies had friends who were straights. My friends who were straights had friends who were hippies. This was true throughout. And as the 1970s evolved and came to a close, the, the cultural separation stopped. You had hippies joining the straight world, getting jobs, settling down. And you also had the straight world adopting a lot of hippie culture, you know, sort of less formal dress, more tolerant attitudes on drugs and sex. So you had the cultural cleavage kind of healing itself. Today's cultural cleavage is sharpest now, I think, between white college educated women and white men without a college education. And first of all, you have those people basically living in different worlds. It's not the way I describe high school and college with people sharing friends. They're living in different zip codes. They're not interacting with one another in any kind of, you know, friendly, socially, uh, you know, socially meeting fashion. Um, and I don't see them a convergence between, you know, coming down the road between the values of college educated white women and non-college educated white men. I don't see how, I don't see that um, kind of blending, synthesizing the way the hippies and the straights kind of ultimately synthesized. So that's what my sense of it being worse now. Why is it worse now? I think I speculate two reasons. One is this sort of we've separated out by zip codes. You know, when in the 60s, people had, you know, very different points of view, a lot of dislike for each other's point of view, but they lived in the same zip codes. Now, increasingly, we don't. You have the coastal enclaves versus the sort of Midwestern small towns. Just so there's this cultural separation, which leads to political separation and political polarization. A second reason is the change in media, and there are several ways that I think this affects things. But here's a subtle one. My guess is right now you are having trouble paying attention. I mean, if you're anything like me, you're having trouble paying attention. And part of the reason that you're having trouble paying attention is that you're by yourself. If you're in a classroom and you're with a bunch of people and you have the same boring lecture going on, you have other people looking at the speaker. And our human instinct that we get from as early as 6 months as a baby is when we see other people attending to something, we pay attention to it. So if you're in a group of people in a classroom, you get this automatic impetus to pay attention to the speaker by the fact that there are other people in the room watching the speaker. When you're by yourself, you don't have that. So what our media must do to get our attention is give us dopamine hits. They can't, you know, when we were watching television 50 years ago, we were watching, there was one television in the household, we were all watching it, and so you still had these kind of social cues of other people paying attention, and so you paid attention. So the television didn't have to work as hard to grab your attention. The 21st century media have to work a lot harder, and of course they've learned how to, uh, through a Darwinian mechanism, learned how to get your attention, and that's mainly through dopamine hits. They have to give you dopamine hits. So that includes things like porn, games, and demonization, because it turns out that if you read a tweet or you otherwise see something that demonizes the other side, that will give you a dopamine hit. And so just as through this Darwinian process, the online media have learned that demonization is a way uh, to get your attention, and they need to grab your attention. Um, so that that is obviously a very worrisome development. Um, so I want to finish on two notes. First, I want to say what I've always said about how to address demonization and polarization, and that is try to recognize that demonization is bad, recognize when your own side is doing it, and kind of back away from it and say, wait, no, I'm going to try to make a charitable interpretation of the other side. I'm going to try to understand what they're really saying and answer what they're really saying, not demonize them. I'm going to operate in persuasion mode. And to sort of reward other people for operating in persuasion mode, model operating in persuasion mode, and give other people rewards for operating in persuasion mode. That's my general solution. The last thing I will end on is kind of a postscript to the book, how my thinking has evolved, and I've actually gotten quite a bit more worried and concerned uh, and frightened about it. I think on one side you have the current president who is modeling the opposite behavior that I'm arguing for. That is, he's certainly not charitable to the other side. He treats disagreement not as an opportunity to learn, but as an opportunity to try to humiliate other people, taking everything personally. He models kind of the opposite of this persuasion mode behavior that I want to see. And on the other side, we have the sort of fanatical social justice activists. I call it social justice activism as a religion that seeks to identify and persecute heretics. Um, Recently, a few weeks ago, there was a letter published in Harper's Magazine. I don't know if you saw it, but it was signed by about 150 public intellectuals, mostly to the left of center, some a little bit to the right of center. But they were saying, trying to reiterate the values of free speech and open inquiry and being charitable to people who disagree. That is, interpreting what they have to say the way they would want to interpret it, not by accusing them of having bad motives and of being barbaric or oppressors, what have you. The response to that letter by social justice activists was to basically demonize the people who wrote that letter. They said, you're you're arguing for old values that support white supremacy, white male supremacy. That kind of demonization rhetoric, I think, has been accentuated by uh, as I said, by the contemporary media. People are now more isolated, and especially now with the virus, people are more isolated, relying more and more on these media that grab your attention by giving you dopamine hits from demonizing opponents. So that an ideology, this extreme reductionist social justice ideology, which says that everything is all about power relationships between different groups of people. That kind of reductionist ideology, when you're isolated and relying on electronic media the way we are, is very seductive, and I think it becomes very powerful in the current environment, and that's unfortunate because I think reductionism is intellectually weak. We've had attempts in the past to reduce, very nuanced, complex social beliefs to some one underlying cause, like Freudianism, everything reduced to the Oedipus complex. These intellectual attempts at reductionism have always failed, and I think they're not a good description of how people form their views. And this form of reductionism, of it's all about power, is particularly dangerous because it leads you to just want to exercise power over people, to demonize them, and rather than to try to persuade them. So to me, that's extremely dangerous and worrying. So my postscript is I've become more pessimistic since writing the book. I wrote it under the assumption that, well, any normal person will want to engage in persuasion, and once they realize that certain forms of rhetoric are instead focused on demonization, they'll back off that and they'll switch. But we now have an ideology that says, no, if you believe in persuasion rhetoric, if you believe in that kind of stuff, you're a bad guy. You're just a white male supremacist. That, in some sense, there's no answer to that. And someone, I can't, if someone's really committed to that, it won't help them to read my book. So anyway, that's on a pessimistic note, and I'm afraid I'm going to end there.